Our story begins during the Eastern Tang Dynasty, more specifically within the walls of the royal palace. And of course, if we're talking about the royal palace, that means members of the royal family must be involved. The person in question is none other than the pink-haired empress herself. She was questioning one of her subordinates, asking if they were trying to pressure her into something. Naturally, they denied it at first. However, they quickly added that this so-called Ling Xiao, who seemed to be the protagonist, was nothing more than an ordinary mortal. As such, he was not a suitable match for Her Majesty, Tian Huang. Since he lacked the ability to cultivate, he was seen as an unworthy candidate for marriage. Instead, they suggested she find someone of a higher standing, such as Wei Jun, the son of General Wei. Wei Jun was not only of noble blood, but had also achieved a breakthrough into the Dragon Phoenix realm, making him a far more suitable partner for the Empress. For those unfamiliar with the term, the Dragon Phoenix realm was associated with dual cultivation. When a man and a woman both possessed the Dragon Phoenix connection, their cultivation abilities would advance significantly if they were together. Despite this, Tian Huang had no interest in their suggestions. She cut them off immediately, ordering them to stop talking about the subject. But her advisors persisted, urging her to reconsider unless she intended to go against the imperial court's expectations. When they brought up rumors of her moving into the Guo manor, she didn't hesitate to confirm them. Moreover, she made it clear that anyone who tried to stop her would pay with their life. If the Empress was so determined to be with Ling Xiao, he had to be quite the man, right? Well, shifting the scene to Guo Manor, where the supposed protagonist resided, it seemed the minister's concerns weren't unfounded. By his own admission, Ling Xiao was nothing more than a carefree playboy who had no talent for cultivation. Instead, he spent his time feeding fish and teasing stray cats. Frustrated, he blamed his father for filling his head with unrealistic expectations. His father had always claimed that he possessed a mysterious power sealed within him, something called the Seed of Enlightenment. However, after all these years, nothing had happened. As far as Ling Xiao was concerned, he was living an ordinary life. Well, perhaps not ordinary, but certainly comfortable, thanks to his father's wealth and influence. Still, he knew he should be grateful instead of directing his frustration at his father. Just as he was contemplating this, someone interrupted his thoughts. They informed him that the daughter of Sheng Sheng Shu, what a complicated name, had been spotted meeting with the eldest son of General Wei's family. Yes, the very same man that the ministers wanted to pair with the Empress. Curious, Ling Xiao questioned what on earth they were doing there. Before he could get an answer, a loud commotion erupted. The people in question had arrived rather dramatically, forcing their way through the gates without hesitation. The girl immediately began speaking, her intentions clear from the very first words she uttered. The protagonist was an ordinary mortal who had dared to approach her, even attempting to take away her innocence. As punishment for such audacity, he was ordered to kneel and admit his mistake. The woman in question was Qinju Yuan, and standing beside her, as previously mentioned, was Jing Jun, the son of General Wei. Jing Jun declared that the protagonist should listen to Juwan's words because, if he complied, he might be spared and even given a chance to serve as a subordinate, tasked with sweeping his courtyard. However, the protagonist, unwilling to submit, defiantly questioned who they thought they were. As he recalled, Gao Yuan had been playing with her hair when a foul stench suddenly filled the air, so strong that it seemed like she hadn't bathed in a week. Overwhelmed by the smell, he felt nauseous and ended up vomiting on her. That completely contradicted the accusation against him, and, in reality, the ones who owed an apology were them, as they had barged into the Guoxi mansion uninvited. Jing Jun, however, was unfazed. With his father absent, the fate of the Guoxi mansion was irrelevant to him, so he insisted that the protagonist kneel and confess his mistake. Otherwise, he would be forced to comply. But the protagonist wasn't the type to back down. He smirked and asked if Jing Jun was just showing off in front of Ji Yuan. Annoyed, one of Jing Jun's subordinates charged at him, but the protagonist easily dodged the attack. After all, background characters stood no chance against the lead. To prove his point, he effortlessly kicked the poor guy away, taunting Jing Jun for sending such weaklings after him. Infuriated, Jing Jun ordered all his subordinates to attack at once. This time, the protagonist struggled. He was strong, but not invincible. The group overwhelmed him and he was beaten down mercilessly. As he endured the blows, he realized that moments like these proved he hadn't trained hard enough. His procrastination had made him weak. He even felt ashamed, silently apologizing to his father for being a failure. Just as he was coughing up blood, a sudden notification rang in his mind. Something clicked. Though the beating continued, he began to understand something deep within him. At that moment, a strange power awakened inside his body. An unfamiliar word surfaced in his thoughts. A technique known as the Tiger's Box, a martial art belonging to General Wei's lineage. Confused but desperate, the protagonist decided to wield this newfound knowledge to defend himself. And just like that, another nameless opponent was sent flying. The protagonist was utterly shocked. He had just executed the Tiger Punch and fully grasped the technique. However, unlike him, Jingjun didn't seem surprised at all. No, he was just as arrogant as ever. Instead of acknowledging the feat, he scoffed, saying he never expected a mere mortal to possess such martial arts. But even with a technique like that, the protagonist was still nothing more than trash. Before he could react the next moment, a devastating punch sent the protagonist flying an absurd distance, easily hundreds of meters. Of course, that number was exaggerated, but the point was that he was launched ridiculously far. As he struggled to recover, that familiar sensation hit him again, a notification, a rush of understanding. But this time, it wasn't just about learning. Words about absorption and energy filled his mind. His body, however, was barely holding together. Meanwhile, Ji Yuan approached Jingjun, showering him with admiration. She called him strong, incredible, and took the chance to make a request. She wanted the protagonist to be cut into pieces and fed to the dogs. But before that order could be carried out, a new presence arrived. A commanding voice rang out, declaring that if anyone should be thrown to the dogs, it was Ji Yuan herself. At that moment, the expressions of both Ji Yuan and Jingjun twisted in horror. It was obvious who had arrived. The woman questioned if they had somehow started a rumor about her being dead without her knowing, because they were awfully bold to say such things about her, man. Faced with the Empress, the two immediately began to tremble and beg for forgiveness. But she had no patience for nonsense. Without hesitation, she struck both of them hard across the face. The protagonist, still recovering, turned to the Empress and told her she shouldn't have come. Her presence would only spark rumors. But she stepped closer, completely unfazed, and declared that she didn't care what people said. The protagonist was the only man she would ever marry, and anyone who dared to harm him would face the wrath of 9 generations of her vengeance. That single statement was enough to make the men in the room tremble, especially Jingjun. Ji Yuan, however, still held her ground, boldly stating that she was the daughter of the Minister of Rites and a disciple of the Lai sect. Even the Empress couldn't act against her without consequences. Huang simply tilted her head and asked if that was supposed to be a threat. The tension was about to explode when the protagonist intervened. He stopped Huang before she unleashed her full power, insisting that she shouldn't waste her energy on this. More importantly, he refused to hide behind a woman forever. This humiliation was his to avenge, and in 3 days he would recover and settle this himself. With that, the matter was temporarily put to rest. Half an hour later, in the back garden of the Guoxi mansion, the protagonist sat deep in thought. After being brutally beaten, something within the protagonist suddenly clicked. He could now comprehend the martial arts techniques his opponents had been using. It was almost certainly due to the enlightenment seed embedded in his body. Ever since that severe beating, a strange power had been awakening within him. Noticing the protagonist cultivating at an astonishing speed, Huang couldn't help but wonder if he was finally about to awaken. Internally, the protagonist was overjoyed. Not long ago, people had mocked him, calling his body a dead core because he was incapable of cultivating. But now, his core had successfully condensed, and his cultivation realms were skyrocketing. However, he didn't just break into the first level. Thanks to the enlightenment seed, he was progressing at an even more terrifying rate. Outside his mindscape, the sheer power radiating from his body sent shockwaves through the surroundings. His cultivation surged uncontrollably until he leaped straight to the 9th level of creation. Huang was utterly stunned. Memories flooded her mind of how the protagonist had once been treated as worthless, constantly belittled and oppressed. But now, he was a completely different person. The disturbance he was causing was no small matter. It had triggered what was known as a heaven and earth phenomenon, an event that occurred when an extraordinary treasure or an immense power emerged. In the world of cultivation, this was a well-known occurrence, and naturally, it drew attention. People began to take notice of the strange radiance emanating from the Guoxi mansion, eager to investigate and seize whatever opportunity awaited inside. But that wasn't going to happen. The Empress was present, and wherever she went, her guards followed. Without hesitation, she issued a command. No one was to approach the mansion. Anyone who disobeyed would be executed on the spot. Half an hour later, the protagonist finally allowed himself some rest. After all, even cultivators weren't made of steel. Reclining on the legendary divine cushions, he enjoyed a handful of grapes in utter relaxation. Huang, watching him, suddenly asked why he kept staring at her. Naturally, the protagonist, never one to hold back, immediately replied that she was simply too beautiful to ignore. More than that, he wanted to thank her. Despite being nothing more than trash for so many years, unable to cultivate, she had remained by his side. After all, she was the rightful empress of the Eastern Tang dynasty. But Huang dismissed his words, saying it wasn't quite like that. She had only managed to ascend to the throne in recent years because of him, because he had helped her behind the scenes. The influence she held today was thanks to the countless problems she had resolved, many of which she could only handle due to his intervention. To her, the protagonist had saved her life, and for that reason, he was the only man she would ever acknowledge. However, before she could continue speaking, her body suddenly collapsed to the ground, an overwhelming surge of icy energy radiating from her. Apparently, this whole situation was caused by what the protagonist had warned Huang about earlier. She shouldn't have used her icy body. Now, it was clear that she couldn't control it, and things were escalating quickly. The protagonist, seeing the severity of the situation, mentioned that he would administer an injection to help her. However, Huang immediately objected, insisting that he stay away. The cold emanating from her body was too dangerous, and she didn't want him to get hurt. But of course, the protagonist ignored her warnings and moved closer, much to her distress. She couldn't bear the thought of him risking his life for her. Meanwhile, the protagonist was deep in thought, wondering if he could use his own vitality to counteract the overwhelming cold. Determined, he assured her that he would help and prepared a needle to suppress the freezing energy within her. But as they spoke, the cold only intensified. Huang desperately pleaded with him to step back, but he endured it, relying on the power of the enlightenment seed to resist. However, she was beginning to lose consciousness. At that moment, an idea struck him. What if he could absorb the cold itself? Acting on impulse, he attempted to draw in the icy energy using the enlightenment seed. Incredibly, the deadly cold was converted into vitality within his body. It was an unbelievable ability, transforming something harmful into a life force. But with their close proximity, Huang, convinced that they were both about to die, suddenly leaned in and kissed him. Whether it was due to their energies colliding or something else entirely, the moment shifted and warmth began to spread between them. The protagonist, however, was struggling to push her away, but at this point Huang had already latched onto him. Even nature itself seemed to acknowledge what was happening. Birds in the distance turned away as if avoiding the scene. Sometime later, whether it was hours or the next day, it was hard to tell, the protagonist sighed, commenting that he had nearly been drained completely. In fact, he barely managed to regain control in time. Just before it was too late, he had activated a long-lost and supposedly extinct technique, the 9 needles of the sun's return. This technique managed to suppress the burning force within Huang and dampen her icy aura, at least temporarily. However, it was clear that the needle wouldn't hold for long. As they had seen before, the cold would only grow stronger over time. But then something unexpected happened. Because he had used the secret 9 needles of the sun's return, the enlightenment seed began to react. The protagonist's understanding of the technique deepened drastically. It was as if he had unlocked a hidden cheat code. Just moments ago, he had only known about the technique without truly grasping its depths. Now, after using it once, he had already mastered about 30% of it. If he kept practicing, it would only be a matter of time before he perfected it entirely. With this newfound comprehension, the protagonist realized that saving Huang's life would no longer be a problem. Without hesitation, he got to work. As he performed the needle technique, he noticed something remarkable. The enlightenment seed was actively guiding him. It wasn't just helping him resolve the immediate crisis, it was teaching him a complete treatment method to cure Huang's underlying condition. This method was called the Phoenix Supplementation Pill Refinement Technique. However, the list of ingredients required was so extensive that even attempting to process all the information felt overwhelming. Rather than dwelling on it, he decided to set that matter aside for now. The important part was that there was a cure. Meanwhile, deep within his consciousness, the enlightenment seed had begun to sprout, which likely meant even more overpowered abilities would soon awaken. Not long after, Huang finally regained full consciousness. Compared to before, she seemed much more stable. With unwavering gratitude, she once again declared that the protagonist had saved her life. Because of that, she proclaimed, her life now belonged to him. The protagonist, slightly exasperated, asked if she ever got tired of saying that. More than that, shouldn't she have already forgotten about it by now? But Huang was firm. She would never stop reminding him. Out of the countless people in the world, there was only one person she wanted to marry, and that was him. However, she admitted that the time wasn't right just yet. Still, she felt relieved knowing that both he and her condition were no longer in danger. Even so, she asked if he was truly sure about curing her illness. After all, her body possessed the frozen phoenix constitution, and not even the greatest physicians in the empire had been able to treat her. The protagonist responded with confidence. Now that he could cultivate, he had found a complete cure for her condition. All she needed to do was trust him. Without hesitation, Huang declared that she believed in him completely. Later that night, the protagonist sat reading some old books. It turned out these books had belonged to his father. There was also a spatial ring that he had never been able to open, until now. With his recent awakening, it was finally time to see what was inside. When he activated the ring, he found an impressive collection of martial arts manuals, rare pills, and numerous pouches filled with unknown items. Though he couldn't decipher all the writings, one thing was clear. His father seemed to be quite the narcissist, based on the comments left behind. However, there was one note that had been translated clearly. His father had written that he should train hard and master the martial arts of the 3 realms of Qi refinement. That way, he could go out into the world and make a name for himself, and in doing so, allow his father to boast about his incredible son. The protagonist found this message a bit strange, but as he thought about it more, he began to piece things together. Apparently, his father had left home on a mission to find a way to bring his mother back to life. The protagonist had unintentionally started picking up martial arts techniques from the very people who used to beat him up. He gradually realized that his father must have known about this ability. However, according to the letter he had received, his father wanted him to reach the 3rd realm of cultivation. This part was confusing. Was he supposed to merge 3 realms? No, that had to be a translation mistake. It didn't make sense. As for the technique he had obtained, something called the 8 desolate sacraments, it sounded ridiculously exaggerated. But there was no harm in at least giving it a read, right? The moment he started going through the book, the words seemed to flow straight into his mind. Instantly, he found himself grasping everything written in it. At that moment, he began reflecting on something called the primitive level, where martial arts techniques were ranked from 1 to 10 stars. Oddly enough, the ranking system worked in reverse. 1 star was the most powerful, and above that came the highest stage, known as the epic level. No one seemed to be aware of this, or at least the protagonist had never heard of it before. Yet the martial art his father had given him, now mysteriously renamed 8 Sacred Remnants or something similar, turned out to be an ancient secret that went beyond the epic level. In short, it was even more powerful than something the protagonist had never even known existed. While processing all this information, he suddenly wondered if the primordial stone buried underground had something to do with it. After all, his father had set up some kind of formation. But what kind of formation? He had no idea. Honestly, he felt just as lost as anyone else. Stepping outside, he wandered into the backyard, where he spotted a flower growing by a tiny pond at the far end of his house. As he approached, he realized he had never thought much about it before. But now, thanks to this newfound enlightenment, he saw things differently. It wasn't illumination in the sense of light, but rather understanding. He had learned something new. What shocked him the most was the realization that the small pool his father had always cared for wasn't just a simple pond. It was actually a spiritual spring. Maybe that was part of the reason his father had left him in charge of everything there. Feeling that this discovery was just the beginning, he decided to take a sip of the water before investigating further. The moment he drank it, an incredible transformation occurred. He instantly jumped from the first level of condensation all the way to the 5th level in a single moment, just by drinking a bit of water. And of course, he wasn't about to stop there. An hour later, he had already cultivated up to the 9th level of condensation. Since the spiritual water had worked so well, it was now time for the next step, eating that golden lotus. At this point, he had only grasped about 10% of the technique, whose name had already changed multiple times by now. This is exactly the downside of translating works straight from China. Things can get pretty convoluted. But regardless, the protagonist had finally gotten his opportunity, and he wasn't about to waste time procrastinating. A few days passed, and soon enough, the 3-day deadline he had set for himself arrived, the day he had promised to reclaim his honor. Meanwhile, Huang was feeling uneasy. She was aware that the protagonist had awakened his abilities, but was that really enough for him to defeat those people? As she pondered this, a minister arrived, Chen Mo, the Minister of Rights and the father of the girl who had been forced to accept blame for a crime. He openly admitted that the fault lay with him for failing to raise his daughter properly. Because of that, he asked Huang to forgive his daughter and punish him instead. Internally, however, he knew that both Jianjun and Zhao Yuan wouldn't give up on invading the Guoxi Manor. Before the situation could spiral out of control, he decided to take the initiative. He publicly confessed his mistakes and presented himself as weak in front of the gathered authorities. That way, he hoped to prevent Zhao Yuan from being punished in public. However, Huang saw right through his scheme. She immediately declared that since Minister Chen Mo was such a just man and had voluntarily asked for punishment, they should simply drag Zhao Yuan out and execute her. Naturally, this terrified Chen Mo, but before he could react, another figure stepped forward, the father of the other troublemaker. And that man was none other than General Wei himself. General Wei stated that this was nothing more than a fair competition between young fighters. Since it was just a battle between juniors, there was no real harm in settling things in the ring. Huang, however, responded with a sharp remark. She praised his noble heart, but pointed out that if someone were trying to break into his mansion, he certainly wouldn't just sit back and allow it. That left the general momentarily speechless. She continued, stating that in this competition, both Jianjun and Zhao Yuan would have to accept the consequences. If they lost and died, that was their fate. However, if they dared to win against the protagonist, they would still be defeated. Wait, what? What was even the point of a match where they had no chance of victory? Faced with this situation, Zhao Yuan, unwilling to back down, called out to the emperor, asking him to simply execute her right there if he truly wanted to uphold justice through Li Yang. That blatant challenge enraged Huang even more. Zhao Yuan was provoking her again, and even though she had the support of Li Yang, Huang wasn't afraid to strike her down. Just as she was about to make her move, a massive pillar of ice suddenly formed, cutting through the tension in the air. Then a figure appeared in the sky, calmly calling for Huang to stand down. He declared that if anything happened to his disciple, he would personally deliver severe punishment once she returned to Li Yang. From the way he spoke, it was obvious. The man floating above them was none other than Zhao Yuan's master. His name was Razin, and he had come for one reason only. A master must always stand by his disciple, and we'll see it in the next episode. Remember to subscribe and leave a like.